book that's on the screen, particularly about healing developmental trauma, early trauma that has affected your ability to sort of self-regulate. It affects how you see yourself and it affects your relationships. It talks about mainly like, some patterns when it comes to trauma and how to move beyond them. And so I want to start that conversation today. No way I can get through all of this information. Hopefully, you can do it over like maybe multiple weeks or something, but just wanted to start the conversation today because I think this information is really informative and helpful. Um, this text didn't show up the way I wanted, but I like this quote. A psychotherapist put this in one of her books. It was this poem, Out to Play, but that bolded language is what I really um, focused on and is what she focuses on. No hurt survives for long without our help. And that is really the crux of all that we're going to be talking about is just like this idea that what's really insidious about trauma is the way we perpetuate it. So, yes, negative things happen to us. Yes, um, we have to endure things that are unfair. But most things, most damage, most emotional, psychological, spiritual damage, whatever it is, does not really last that long. It's the way we internalize it and perpetuate it ourselves that can be the problem. And that's what we want to focus on and get around. No hurt will survive very long without you helping it to survive. So just quick background on what we mean when we say trauma. Feel free to interrupt me at any time. Like if anything stands out to you, if you want to add anything, if you want to ask about anything, like please interrupt as much as you see fit also. Trauma is just something like we're not able to process. The language I heard that like sounded the best to me was describing it kind of like a baby being fed baby food, right? Like so when a baby is just a couple of months old, you're not going to feed that baby like pizza or meatloaf or something because it just doesn't have the system in place yet to digest that kind of solid adult food. Um, and so trauma is like that. It's sort of like we're being fed something that's like a grown-up meal or heavy adult meal when our digestive systems don't have the capacity at that point to digest, what has happened. And so it gets stuck or we just don't digest it. And that's a good analogy for kind of what trauma is. It's something that happens to us that we just don't have the ability to digest and process and handle. And so it disrupts us because we cannot integrate it and cannot cope with it. Two types of trauma. Developmental trauma is the first trauma. So this is something that happens just gradually over time, usually has to do with the way we're raised, the way we're brought up. Yeah, we're just raised in a traumatizing way. And so it's also called attachment trauma because it shows like it refers to like our failure to get our needs met by our parental caregivers, our authority caregivers. Doesn't necessarily mean that they weren't doing their best, but just we have certain needs when we're children growing up that are basic to our survival. And sometimes we are just in an environment, a situation where the capability to meet our needs is just not there. Um, this can look like verbal abuse. An example of this I saw that stuck with me for years and years and years. I was coming out of the subway in Harlem and I saw this a woman who was fairly young herself pushing a stroller with an infant baby in it, and she had a toddler walking next to her who was just asking for a hug. She was crying, trying to get a hug from her mom, wanted her mom to pick her up, something like that. And her mom just cussed her out. I mean, called her a stupid bitch and all this kind of stuff. Like that is an example of like developmental trauma. Like that child's gonna have to deal with these things that she's just not old enough to process at that age. But it's definitely going to affect her over time. The other type of trauma is shock trauma. These are things like a car accident, a sexual assault is a very common one, or just some horrible violence, seeing somebody be shot, seeing having a gun pointed at you or whatever it is. These are things that kind of shock the system and you're not really able to integrate it or process it. And so it becomes traumatizing in that way. Any questions about any of this stuff? Let me know if I'm going too fast also. Nope. Okay. And so what is insidious about trauma is that it impacts us on multiple levels. And so this triangle here is called the cognitive behavioral triangle. It's used in a form of therapy called CBT therapy. Um, but it's basically this idea, you'll see there are double pointed arrows on each side of this triangle. This basically means that all of these things overlap and impact each other. So in other words, your thoughts, the things you think, that's going to impact what you do, your behaviors, but your thoughts are also going to impact your feelings. Likewise, your actions. Your actions will impact what you think and what you feel and your feelings. If you're in a bad mood, you're more likely to have bad thoughts. If you're in a good mood, you're more likely to have positive thoughts and do positive things. And so trauma impacts all of these. Developmental or shock trauma causes disruptions in the way we think. It causes disruptions in the way we behave on a daily basis, and it definitely causes disruptions in how we feel about ourselves and how we feel about the world. The good news, though, is that just as these three things influence each other negatively, they can also influence each other positively. So when you want to have some sort of healing or intervention, you can really intervene at any one of these three areas. We can start changing our behaviors, and just that shift in how we behave and what we do, that's going to have positive effects on our thoughts and feelings. If we start shifting our thoughts, that will have positive effects on our feelings and behaviors and so on. You know what? I'm gonna not spend too much time on this. So this source material I was looking at, I like because it integrates spirituality to some degree. It talks about this concept of life force, but I guess I would sum it all up as in saying that like energy is actually real, and there are more scientists and psychotherapists and neurobiologists that are kind of fortunately catching on to that. And there is this idea that yeah, there actually is an energy that people carry. You actually the whole vibration and carrying energy in a certain way, having positive energy, negative energy, those things are very real, and trauma impacts the energy in your body. We're just now sort of catching on to it in science, but it's been believed and followed for hundreds of years by hundreds of different cultures. I won't get through all of that in detail, but the bottom line point is at the bottom of the screen. When we're traumatized, a lot of our energy doesn't flow through us the way it's meant to. It can be blocked, it can be constricted, it can be overcharged, and a lot of times it gets displaced. That's the most common one. So that life force energy that should be channeled into certain areas of our lives gets redirected into things like anger or fear or denial. It takes energy. So, for example, to let's say deny that I was molested, that happened to me. And a lot of molestation victims use life force energy to suppress that sort of traumatic event. Um, Something else, again, I'm just sort of highlighting an overarching pattern. I'll go into this a little bit more detail later. But in addition to like your energy being disrupted, it disrupts the way you see yourself. Trauma typically causes a split in your identity. What do I mean by that? It causes you to start to see yourself in negative ways or in shameful ways. And so, for example, the example of that little girl I just gave, whose mother called her that word, she's going to think something is wrong with her, right? The truth is something's wrong with the mother. The mother's not emotionally stable enough to handle that child in that moment, but the child doesn't know that. And children start trying to explain why bad things happen to them. All people do, but especially children. And they'll start to think that something's wrong with them rather than, the truth, which is just something's wrong with the environment that's nurturing them. And so that something must be wrong with me belief is so-called a shame-based identity. And people who have been traumatized, often, whether they know it or not, walk around with these shame-based identity statements inside of them. So I'm not lovable is another one, or I'm a burden, right? And so, a child who feels like they're a burden on their parents holds that shame-based identity consciously or unconsciously, or a whole host of other shame-based identities. But that's just like one of the things that happens to anyone who's been heavily traumatized, they tend to start thinking negatively or shamefully about themselves. On the flip side, right, sometimes that shame is too intense to bear. Like I can't walk around, for example, thinking that I'm unlovable. Um, and so what do? I will try to counterbalance that with something called a pride-based identity. I will inflate my ego. I will, exaggerate myself. So think about a lot of athletes or celebrities or rappers that might do that. Like I'm the best. I'm the top. Nobody can stop me. Um, Muhammad Ali's language comes to mind. Like I float like a butterfly, sting like a bee. I'm the greatest. Yeah. So that kind of inflated sense of pride is often something that you will see in someone who has been traumatized because they're trying to compensate for the shameful kind of self-image they've developed behind the trauma. Just some more examples. Person who feels dumb, exaggerating how smart they are. Person who feels helpless, exaggerating how powerful they are. Someone who feels ugly, exaggerating how pretty they are. I knew a girl, for example, she's very, successful young woman, but she had a lot of trauma from her background, and she had, I think, some shame around feeling attractive or sense of her body. And so she would always do these things like I'm cute, especially, once she started drinking, like every 10 minutes she was talking about like I'm cute or this happened, people don't like me because I'm cute. And no, she just exaggerated over and over how pretty she was. That's an indicator. It was like, okay, underneath that exaggeration, she probably feels ugly, and that's something that she just doesn't have the capacity to deal with. And so tries to overcompensate by like keeps, telling herself how pretty she is. The problem, though, is that as that behavior goes on, it actually, unfortunately, will subconsciously reinforce the shame. So the more she goes around like inflating that, I'm cute thing, it's unfortunately going to perpetuate the hidden belief that she's not. Um, does that make sense? Before I go on, does, what I've said so far about these things make sense? Anything
Yes.
confusing?
Yes.
Yeah, it
Perfect.
makes sense.
Okay. Um, all right. So with that kind of background um in mind, this talk will be about what are called the main survival styles. So in other words, there are certain patterns of trauma that have been sort of studied over time and like, researchers kind of noticed like, okay, well these traumas and these responses to trauma tend to fall into five core categories. Because we're all human, we all have the same basic needs and we all have the same fundamental reactions when those needs go unmet. And so that is how these trauma styles developed. They basically flow out of the failure of these five basic needs being met. And then, like, the trauma survival styles are the way we adapt. Um, and so the key point is like, especially when you're at that age, again, you're being fed pizza and solid food when you're just, 1 month old, you can't digest that. You have to adapt to that in some way to survive. And so it's very helpful to remember that the styles we're about to talk about, these are things that were adaptive for a child's survival. They were adaptive for adolescent survival at the time you were going through that trauma. But the issue is that, going back to the quote in the beginning, no hurt survives very long without our help. The issue is that we perpetuate these things that we needed to survive continuously. They become a style of living for us that is unhealthy. Um, I think a good example will be, let's say you have a flat tire, so you pull out a spare and you put a spare tire on your car. That spare tire is meant to be a temporary thing to get you through that situation. It is not meant for you to drive around permanently on your spare tire that could cause problems. And so that's kind of what these survival styles represent. They're kind of like us living with that spare tire on, as opposed to coming out of that and, being healed. Um, so the big thing is that these survival styles, they help us survive, but they also block us from being fully present and fully alive. That is what we mean when we say the life force doesn't really flow through us. We're not here. Some part of us is absent, You're not really getting the full person. Or the person is present, but they're not really alive. There's some part of them that's sort of like dead or like not at their full potential. So the five main survival styles flow out of a lack of connection, a lack of having attunement from a caregiver, a lack of the development of trust, a lack of the sense of autonomy, and a lack of having integrated love and sexuality.